I'm going to talk about constructors now in C#. What is a constructor? How do they work? Well, let's check it out. So here we have a very simple example. We have a custom class called user. We have 3 variables inside the class, which is information about the user. So first, last, and the age of the user. And then we're just setting up a new object, which is an instance of the class. We're giving it some values, so first name, last name, and age, and outputting it to the screen. So very simple piece of software. So I'm going to introduce a constructor into this example now. So what a constructor does, it helps us construct our objects. So here we're creating a new instance of our class. Here is our object. What a constructor does, it gives us some help with setting up this object. So let's learn by example. I think that would be easier here. So here we're setting up a new user object. I'm just going to copy and paste this one, and we're going to create a new object, another object. Okay, so here I'm creating a new user called Tony Smith, and his age is 41. So when I set up this user, you can see it uses 4 lines of code. And maybe if we want to set up 100 of these, it's not going to look very elegant. It's going to look quite bloated. This is one of the advantages of using constructors. So what I can do, when I create a new instance of this class, I can actually pass these values as parameters when creating a new instance. So what I can do is pass in, say, Tony. I can pass in Smith. And then pass in the age right here. And then I can delete all of these lines of code, and then essentially this line will do exactly the same thing as these 4 lines here. So that's one advantage of constructors, is code minimalization. So it's represented only on 1 line. But how do we set this up? Because right now we have a red line, and if I hover over that, it says user does not contain a constructor that takes 3 arguments. Well, let's go and add one. So I'll go into the user class here, and I need to set up a constructor. So how do I do that? It starts with the internal keyword. Now don't worry about what internal is right now. I'll discuss that in a later tutorial. All constructors take the name of the class. So the name of the class is user. I'm going to put the name of the class there. After that, I put parentheses, and then the familiar curly braces. This is a basic constructor in its minimal form. And we can have more than 1 constructor per class if we want. So what I want to do is take in these values here and initialize them into our variables here. So I want to put those values right here. So what I need to do, when we worked with methods, it works very similar to that. I want to pass them as essentially parameters. So I'm going to do first. So for example, first name, last name, age. And when you give your parameters name, give them meaningful names, such as first name, last name, and age. And make sure they're not exactly the same as these local variables right here. Give them a slightly different casing, for example, or a different name completely. I'll discuss that in a later tutorial when I talk about the this keyword. So for now, our parameters are coming into our constructor here. And now I want to initialize these local variables with these values right here. And it's very easy to do that. I take the local variable here, and I set it as the value of the parameter. So that's 1 done already, and we'll carry on for the other 2. So Visual Studio has helped us there nicely. So let's just review what is going on here. So now the red line has gone away. If I hover over this, it's working, there's no red line. So I'm passing in a string, and an integer into the constructor for the class when creating our object. So these values get passed in as parameters into the constructor, which is all of this. And then the value of the parameters get assigned, initialized into our local variables here. So now these local variables here will forever hold these values for as long as this instance remains alive in our system. So that's pretty cool, isn't it? So let me just run the software real quick so you can see what's going on. I'm going to comment this out and I'll come back to that in a second. So now let's just put that there. So no problems, we'll run the software. So right now you can see it says Tony Smith, age 41. So it looks like it's working correctly. So let me just undo those comments and talk about one more thing. So you can see something interesting now. There's a red line underneath this part right here when we try to set up a new object. It's no longer working. Why is that? That's because in our class here, by default, we have no constructor. So it looks like this. However, once we define a constructor with parameters like this one, we can no longer set up an instance of our class like this. There's an easy way to get around that. We define just a very basic constructor with no parameters, like so. And now you can see this red line is gone and everything's happy. So how is that working? Well, when we call this constructor here, when we create this object, we're passing in 3 parameters. So when this line is executed by the software, the code execution jumps into here and everything is set up here. When we create a new instance using this line right here, there's no parameters. So this constructor is called instead. So this is never run, only this section here. And there's nothing going on here. So now that's the difference between the two. There's actually 2 constructors now inside this class. This is using the first constructor. This is using the second. And we can have 50 constructors if we want to, but that's kind of how things are going on internally inside our class. So you can see constructors have allowed us to minimize code, on only one line, for example. But what else can they do? What's another benefit? Well, constructors, like I say, can help you construct your object. And it kind of does it behind the scenes. So from this file right here, we don't really need to know how this user is set up. We're just kind of passing it some information and we can kind of get it back when we want it. So all of that kind of logic is hidden away from us, which is pretty cool. So constructors can internally kind of do some stuff we don't need to worry about behind the scenes. For example, if I call this constructor by passing in the 2 names and the age, I could output something to the window. For example, I could tell the user we're setting up a new user, for example. So when I run the software now, you can see I get a little message saying, okay, please wait, I'm just setting up a new user, and then it outputs the information. So constructors can kind of do some extra stuff. They don't need to just set up variables. They could log to a database, they could talk to a website, they could open a database connection. They can do lots of kind of internal things behind the scenes. So this is how they kind of help construct an object, and this is why they're called constructors. So constructors are pretty powerful elements of object-oriented programming. And you can see using this example in this tutorial how it kind of simplifies things. Perhaps not in the class itself, but definitely working from out here, you can see how simple everything looks by just using one line of code to set up an object. And we don't need to worry about the internal things going on here. So that is an example of constructors in C#, and I hope you find it quite useful.